welcome to Sounding Board, a community access television program of Seroptimus International of Novato. My name is Madeline Peters, and my very special guest today is Dr. Linda Sartor, who I will have her talk a little bit more about her background in a moment. But first, a little bit about Seroptimus. Seroptimus International's mission is improving the lives of women and girls through programs leading to social and economic empowerment. We're an organization that's international in scope with over 100,000 members worldwide. Dr. Sartor, Linda Sartor, is here to talk about her book, Turning Fear into Power, One Woman's Journey Confronting the War on Terror. So Linda, I'm so glad to have you here. I've been following your story for quite a number of years, and certainly following your communication with people when you go and do these, when are visiting in other countries. Can you just explain a little bit more about your background before we get into you talking about your journey, the journey of probably the last 14 years, I think?
Yeah, so I've always been a peace activist all my adult life, probably from childhood. My first protest was in high school, I remember, protesting the Vietnam War, and an educator. So a peace activist, protester, educator, and during the 90s I was beginning to think that we were getting beyond war, and then all of a sudden after 9/11 it was like all of the work that we've been doing and progress we've been making to get beyond war was reversed, and my heart was tormented by the way the U.S. was responding to the event of 9/11, and so protesting and educating weren't enough any longer. My heart was tormented, and one of the other things I do is I guide wilderness trips where people go out and do a 3-day fast in the wilderness, in the desert, where they really get more in touch with what their heart is calling them to do, and they always face some sort of fears. So I have been witnessing, I've done that experience myself, and witnessing people go through that experience, facing their fears of going out for 3 days and nights to be alone in the desert. So because of that work, I was more in touch with what my heart was calling me to do. And so when my heart was saying, you've got to get out there and do something that says with your body that I had to get out and do something that said with my body that my life isn't any more precious as a U.S. American citizen than anybody else's life in the world. So I was open to finding something like that, and ended up the first trip I did was to Israel, Palestine, to join the international solidarity movement. It was a particularly volatile time in Palestine in 2002. It was spring of 2002, and the international solidarity movement was bringing internationals in to be with the Palestinian people while the Israeli soldiers were confronting them and following their orders, basically.
Yes.
And so that was my first trip, but it was the first chapter of the book really is about my process of working through my own fears, even when so many good reasons showed up that I could easily have talked myself out of going. It was like this heart of mine was saying, you can't not do this. It doesn't matter how scared you are or what might happen, you just have to do it.
Well, I think to me it helps to set the context. Here you are as one person, here you are describing your own sort of anxieties and fears, and also just what you did to really kind of put yourself into the position of taking these risks despite what your feelings were and becoming the activist that you wanted to be. I know this book is a recording of your journeys in many ways. Before you tell the stories even more, one of the things that impressed me just in reading this book was the passages on the back cover and also in the book itself. And I was wondering if you would consider reading this aloud so that our viewing audience can hear this in your own words, because this particularly struck me. I've known you for some time and I knew of your work, but to me, this helped me see exactly what you did coming from that position of having to look at what your own fears and anxieties were and kind of push ahead to your commitment to use your body to, again, show people that their lives are as precious to you as your life is precious to you. So would you mind just starting off by reading this? And
Sure.
it's again, her book is Turning Fear into Power, One Woman's Journey, Confronting the War on Terror by Linda Sartor. So please go ahead and let's hear it in your own voice.
It is late in the day as we get close to Balata. A Palestinian ambulance passes us. Ambulances are the only Palestinian vehicles that are out on the street during curfew. A tank further ahead fires a line of machine gun fire at the ground in front of the ambulance and us. A very scary warning not to proceed further. At first, we are jolted and swerve to the side in unison. Someone reminds us of Starhawk's teaching to ground, and then we turn and walk in the other direction. The ambulance stops, and we all climb aboard. The two Palestinians in the vehicle are grim as they drive us around to another entrance into Balata camp. It is growing dark, and we know that it is dangerous to be out after dark because the soldiers can't see who we are. We see that we have to walk past another tank. The 11 of us clump closely together and put our hands up as we pass. I keep reassuring myself with the idea that it would be bad public relationships for an Israeli soldier to hurt a U.S. citizen, since their operations would not be possible without our funding.
I thought this was interesting to read this on the back cover of your book, and then also to read it in the context with your footnote, and that you're, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it was how your constant emotions as well as your commitment continue to interact as you are actually living this important job of being a peacekeeper in Israel, Palestine, and in the other places you've been. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, the footnote said that that this whole scene occurred before Rachel Corrie, and I don't know how many people remember or even heard of Rachel Corrie, but she was there in Palestine with the International Solidarity Movement a few years after I was there, and she was standing between a bulldozer and a Palestinian home that the bulldozer was destroying, and she got killed by an Israeli soldier driving a bulldozer. So my my false feeling of security, I don't know if I would have gone to Palestine after that story and done this, what I did. But I felt bold, thinking that I had this little bubble of protection, which really wasn't there.
Well, again, too, I think that's the thing that I understand in reading your work, your inner feelings that you bring with you as you're taking a very, very active step in being an unarmed peacekeeper.
Yeah, one friend of mine actually who read the book, he said, I've read lots of self-help books, and this was the best one I've ever read. And this is not meant to be a self-help book, but it does show my inner process because that's the important message I want people to get, is that it really doesn't matter what we do. If we follow our hearts, I think the world will be better off. And a lot of times fear is what gets in the way of us following our hearts. So I just want to encourage people to do that.
Well, and actually, it had that effect on me too. You made me think, reading your book made me think, what is it that I'm fearful about? Well, here's Linda. She's really worked on hers and gone out and kind of stepped into this role. I mean, it was nothing as substantial as really what you've done, but it's interesting. It was like I had to look at what my fears were and what my fears were doing to keep me from doing what I felt was in my heart. Yeah. So part self-help, but also a bigger purpose too. I know you have a lot of stories to tell, and I want to make sure that we have ample opportunity for you to tell your story. And starting off with that, you reading that section about your experience in Israel, Palestine is important. But please, this program is yours, Linda, so share with us.
Well, there's actually two roles that I felt like I played in the various countries. I was in 6 different countries over the 10-year period following 9/11. And I would say that some of the times I was being in the role of civilian civilian diplomat, and other times I was in the role of unarmed civilian peacekeeper, citizen diplomat,
okay.
and unarmed civilian peacekeeper. So that example of when I was in Israel Palestine was really more like the unarmed civilian peacekeeper. The first role I'd like to talk about, though, is citizen diplomat, and I have 3 little vignettes, 3 little stories I can tell. The first one is actually when we were leaving Iraq. The hotel clerk, the receptionist at the hotel, came in on his day off to say goodbye to us. And the reason I want to give this story is that the idea of citizen diplomacy is to really get to know people as citizens of countries that the media and our governments might be trying to portray us as enemies, but really to get to know people as people and to develop trust and learning and bring that home, bring the stories home to our home to share, because our media doesn't always give this picture of people.
Well, it's the media. One always gets the feeling that everything is sanitized for the American public's view.
Yeah.
And so we're actually living that, both being a U.S. American living in the United States and then taking on this active responsibility, I am going to say, and then getting to know those people and then carrying their stories back
yeah.
and
So
articulating
this is
them.
one
Okay.
of the stories, and it's fairly quick. So he came in to say goodbye to us on his day off because we had developed a relationship, and he was
Right.
appreciating that we were there. He put his hand over his heart, which was a gesture that I saw many times in Iraq, which is a gesture like of greeting, and so he put his hand over his heart, and these are the words that he said. He said, I don't have a wife or a child, but all the earth community is my family. All of you are my brothers and sisters. If there is a war, if there is no war, it doesn't matter. I still have my smile. And we were there the month before the U.S. started bombing Iraq. And it was like we knew President Bush had been talking about bombing Iraq for months, and we knew it was imminent. This particular delegation that I got to be part of, they required that everyone on that delegation have some experience in a war zone. We didn't know if the bombing was going to start while we were there. Fortunately, it didn't start. Because I had my 2-week time in Israel Palestine, that gave me the prerequisite to be in Iraq. But anyway, so he's talking about the possibility of war and saying it doesn't matter, because he sees all of us as brothers and sisters.
You really, made a significant impact on him. And again, to be able to come back and tell that story all these years later after that experience, and it's sobering to me to listen to that story, because there is the divide from our understanding, a U.S. person's understanding of what's going on.
Right, and the reality, the reality of the people in these countries that I visited are so hospitable. And it's not, I grew up learning to fear the stranger, but that's not part of that culture. Mm-hmm. So they open to the stranger, they open their homes, they serve tea, they'll serve whatever they have even when they don't have much of anything. It's such a different way of being in the world. So it was really easy to get into relationships with the people in the countries that I went to.
Well, it's interesting too the way that you articulate the experience that you had growing up, fearing the other, fearing the stranger. And then here you are in countries in conflict. And
that the U.S. is planning to bomb.
Right, and you're having these close relationships and people are opening their hearts and their homes to you.
Right, exactly, yeah. So the next story also took place in Iraq, and it was, there's 2 things actually I want to contrast. One is that we visited this memorial park, I guess is what you would call it, and it was a bomb shelter that had been bombed by the U.S. in the Gulf War in 1991. So it was a 2-level bomb shelter where people had gone because they wanted to be safe from bombs. And 2 bombs fell, one right after the other. The first one broke through the ceiling of the shelter and went down through the floor, in the ceiling of the second floor, opened up the
like
the
a shaft
pathway.
almost, a pathway.
Yeah, so that the second bomb went in and and blasted and incinerated. 408 people died. 14 people were saved because they were sleeping close enough to the door that their bodies were blasted out the door, and they were safe because of that, or saved because of that. The oldest person who died in that was an 80-year-old man. The youngest was a baby who was only 4 hours old. And the U.S. said it was an accident and called it collateral damage. So there's that story, and I want to contrast that with the story of one of my teammates. After I had left Iraq, several of my teammates stayed on and were there during the beginning of the bombing. And so this was a teammate who had been there, and then he was asked to leave. A lot of the internationals were asked to leave finally because the Iraqi government felt it was unsafe for them to be there. And also they left because they were realizing that food was getting scarce, and it could be more of a detriment to the people for them to be there than for them to leave. So 3 carloads of internationals were leaving Baghdad. We had to drive across Iraq in order to fly out of Jordan. Because of the sanctions at that time, we weren't allowed to fly in and out of Iraq. So they were taking this long trip across the Iraqi countryside in 3 cars that were caravanning, but there was bombs were taking place. So they were in danger. They decided to spread out the caravan so they weren't all right next to each other. And this
so you would not be like one target.
Right, and this was the last car of the 3. And it had a blowout, maybe some shrapnel on the road. They don't know what caused the blowout, and that led to an accident. And so there were 4 people in the car. Some of them were injured. My colleague, friend, teammate was one of the injured. And then all of a sudden they got really worried because there was nobody out on the road because of the bombing, and the other cars were
too far ahead.
Yeah, too far ahead to know what was going on. Fortunately, one Iraqi came by, picked them up, took them to the nearest town. That town had been bombed 2 days earlier. There was only one medical facility left open. It was a small clinic that had 4 beds, and the doctor there took in my colleagues, treated them as best he could, apologized because he didn't have much in the way of like Novocaine or whatever painkiller.
Right.
And my colleague had to have 10 stitches in his head. And the doctor went ahead and did that. When they tried to pay him for what he did, this is what he said. We treat everyone in our clinic, Muslim, Christian, Iraqi, American. We are all part of the same family, you know.
Very sobering.
Yeah.
Very sobering.
Yeah. So that's, and you know, we might want to go on to my story about.
Sure. Good.
About
this is a time for me to hear about your work and for us to share it with a larger audience.
Yeah, so those were 2 examples of citizen diplomacy where I came back with stories about the people that I met while I was there, as well as the people that I met and how that, you know, was not an experience I would have by listening to the media, the U.S. media.
That's true.
So the other role I would say I was playing while I was in these places was as an unarmed civilian peacekeeper. So this is a story that illustrates what that is. And so I was in a country where there had been a massacre, or in a village where there had been a massacre the night before, and we were asked to come. So we came, and the villagers were all really excited to show us. Well, the bodies had to stay in place. There were 14 dead bodies in the village. They had to stay in place until the judge came to view the bodies before they could then be taken and taken care of in the way of the people who lived there. So the people were busy showing us the bodies and telling us what they had seen, and they knew some of the perpetrators of the violence were Navy guys that they were familiar with. And so when the judge came to view the bodies, she was escorted by Navy and police. So you can imagine the tension.
These people had just
the night before there'd been a massacre,
Right.
perpetrated, at least some of the perpetrators were Navy.
Navy.
And now here the
judge
Navy,
is coming
the judge is coming with the
with the
Navy
Navy.
escorting. So the tension in that situation,
I
you
can
can
imagine
feel
it.
it.
Yes, yeah.
And so the women and children all kind of filed into the church yard, and the men sort of clustered closer together on the side of the road. And I put myself where the judge and Navy were coming up from this direction, from the left, and the men were on my right, clustered together. And so I was the first person that they would encounter when they arrived,
Yes.
the Navy and the police and the judge. And so in that moment, I just decided to smile and wave, which was really totally disarming. One of the things I didn't like about being in these countries was how Western women were viewed by men. But that was like using that, because I would never smile and wave at men I didn't know, at strange
Yes.
men there, so that was like totally disarming to them. Everybody just relaxed. You could just feel the tension dissolve. And what I realized in my body in that moment, and reflecting on that moment, is that I was safer in that situation than I would have been if I was armed. So
Yes.
as an unarmed civilian peacekeeper, I was safer because I wasn't armed, because so often violence is from fear.
Yes.
So nobody had any reason to be afraid of me, and it just, and just my presence could shift so that everybody felt more secure. So I could actually provide security without a weapon.
But there you were physically present there, taking that stance. No, stance is not the right word, but as you said, smiling and waving, and you could actually see how people would relax, and that went a long way to kind of diffusing the tension in the situation that could have become volatile.
And who knows whether it would have become violent, but it just showed me how. And then we ended up staying with those people 24 hours for about a week, and they felt safer because we were there unarmed, just because we were present there. I mean, that's part of the idea of unarmed civilian peacekeeping, is providing presence or accompanying people who are doing work that they would otherwise feel afraid to do, to support human rights or peace and justice. And so by being there, available to accompany them on their job, they can actually carry out their work, do peace building and peace making work in their own way, in their own place, where we're just providing a better sense of security by being present in an obvious way. Like I had to be obviously present when I put myself where I put myself,
Right.
next to the men on the road, in order for my presence to be effective in any way.
Well, people had to see this, where you were physically.
I was an outsider present, watching what was going on,
Right.
And then I did something that kind of just reduced the tension for the moment.
I'm not sure I have the same courage that you do. I commend you on your courage and your presence of mind, and whatever reflecting you did to get yourself out of that early on, get yourself out of that being fearful, so that you did put yourself in these situations. Because it seems to me as though in all of these different stories you tell, you and the others that were with you had an impact, had a positive impact to kind of reduce stress and maybe reduce violence, but witness. That's the other thing that comes to mind, is you were there as a witness, as a civilian peacekeeper. And, I never really understood that description until I was beginning to follow some of your work and getting an understanding for what, in fact, this was all about, and also the information that you sent back to all of the people on your list.
Yeah, and the UN is actually in working with the Nonviolent Peace Force, which is one of the organizations that I was with doing this work, about using unarmed civilian peacekeeping in some situations, sending in unarmed civilian peacekeepers rather than armed peacekeepers, which
Right.
is what they generally will do in situations.
That's almost the default idea. You send in armed people in a conflict situation. How many people are involved in this? How many people are we talking about? I mean, I know you mentioned certain organizations which you were part of, and went and made several of these trips as a peacekeeper.
Yeah, I don't know how many people, probably more than I realize, but they're small organizations. The Nonviolent Peace Force has a vision of having a peace army. It's Gandhi's vision, really, of having a peace army of civilians from all over the world who are trained to do this kind of work. And they've grown. I was in the pilot project for the Nonviolent Peace Force in Sri Lanka, and we were a team of 11 when we started. But that work has grown and spread. So they're not in Sri Lanka any longer, but they're in the Philippines, they're in Sudan. They're looking at other countries that they might be able to make a difference in. And there's probably more than, I'm sure there's more than 100 peacekeepers just with the Nonviolent Peace Force. But then there are other organizations as well that have been doing this, like the Peace Brigades International.
Okay, so
on small scale.
So then these organizations have helped spawn other organizations with similar mission and goals and probably similar activities. But it's like you being part of the pilot group of 11 people and then watching this go.
And the Nonviolent Peace Force actually got a lot of their training materials from some of these other organizations who had already been doing the same sort of work on a smaller scale. Christian Peacemaker Teams is one of them, and Michigan Peace Teams is one.
Oh my goodness. Well, I've been shown that we need to wrap up. I do want to just show the title of your book. Again, Turning Fear into Power, One More Woman's Journey, Confronting the War on Terror. This conversation just zipped by, Linda. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us here today. I'd like to thank Seroptimus International of Novato, our volunteer service crew members. I'd also like to thank Leon Johnson, who is our studio engineer, and the Buck Institute for Research on Aging that very generously makes their television studio available for our recordings. Thank you very much. My name is Madeline Peters.